They mocked him, a quiet, elderly farmer living alone with his service dog and haunted past. Teenagers laughed. Developers tried to push him out. Rumors swirled about war trauma and buried secrets. But when the helicopters started circling and military frequencies came alive after decades of silence, everything changed. Now, the estate is abandoned, the field is sealed, and the man they called crazy just sits calmly on his porch, because he knew something they didn't. What was buried beneath his land, and why are government agents showing up in unmarked SUVs? This isn't just a story about vengeance, it's about what happens when the forgotten become the last line of defense. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. They say he was already there when the town got its second traffic light, long before the bakery closed down, before the new gas station replaced the old one, and before the church needed a second service to fit the newcomers. His house sat out, past the ridge, just where the pavement gave up and turned to gravel. No one drove that way unless they had to, and even when they did, they usually turned around at the rusted fence line. Just before the tall field grass swallowed the view, the house leaned to the left, like it had stopped trying to resist the wind years ago. The paint, once a pale blue, had faded to something between bone and memory. The porch sagged under its own weight, its boards worn smooth from time and pacing. But the light above the door still worked. A single yellow bulb that buzzed against the night and never flickered. People said it never went off. Some said it was to keep the coyotes away. Others said it was for something else entirely. He didn't talk much, just nodded, maybe lifted a hand in quiet greeting if someone waved first. He came to town twice a week, always at the same time. Monday mornings, just after sunrise, he'd park his dusty pickup at the edge of the lot behind the hardware store. He'd buy feed, sometimes nails, sometimes just a bag of salt. Thursdays, he'd sit at the diner's far, booth-a-ways, the one nearest the window, and order black coffee with 2 eggs. Scrambled, he never asked for anything else. Never stayed more than 30 minutes. Then he'd vanish back toward the ridge, leaving just $1 tip and the creak of the door swinging closed behind him. Children whispered stories about him, said he kept skeletons in the basement, said he had cameras in the trees. Some said he had built traps in the woods, things left over from the war. No one could name which war, just the war. He didn't correct them, didn't invite curiosity. The stories fed themselves. The adults weren't much better. They'd nod politely if they passed him at the post office, but rarely spoke his name. Most of them didn't even know it. On paper, he was Walter Ray McClendon, but people called him the Colonel, though no one ever said it to his face. It wasn't a nickname. It felt more like a rank left untouched out of respect or unease. He had a limp that never changed sides, a stare that never looked quite at you, and hands that were always steady unless the air held thunder. Those who had lived longest in town said he used to speak more, that he once stood tall, with broad shoulders and clearer eyes. But something had drained out over the years, like time had taken more from him than age should allow. No one knew who he'd lost. Some said a wife, others said a whole platoon. But the house never showed signs of a second toothbrush or flowers in the window. Just him, the porch chair, and the dog. The dog was a heavy-set black shepherd named Ruckus, wore a leather collar with no name tag, just a metal emblem, some kind of military insignia that no one recognized. The dog never barked, never strayed, just sat beside the man, always alert, always still. The kids knew better than to taunt it. Even the teenagers who sneered at everything else gave it a wide berth. Every so often, a car would slow near the property. Outsiders, usually maybe lost, maybe curious. Sometimes they'd linger, maybe taking a photo, or inching the vehicle up the gravel path. The result was always the same. The porch door would creak open, but it was always enough to send them backing up, tires skidding lightly on loose stone. No words, no threat, just that silence that didn't quite feel empty. There was one mailbox at the bottom of the road. It had no flag, no name, but letters still came, postmarked from places with government seals. He never read them at the diner. He always folded them twice and slipped them into his coat pocket. Once, someone saw him burn one in a coffee tin behind the barn. He didn't look around first. He knew someone was watching. He just didn't. Care, they said. He once taught someone a lesson, not with fists, not with guns, just a stare and a sentence whispered at the gas pump. The man moved out of town 3 days later, left his house, and never came back. The details were never clear, but the silence that followed was, and so the town kept its distance. They called him crazy in whispers, but waved from the safety of doorways. They mocked in private, not in public, because something about that old man felt like a secret the earth hadn't finished telling. And secrets like that don't like to be disturbed. The for sale sign went up in late spring, posted on the far edge of the empty pasture that bordered his property to the south. A stretch of wild grass, a crumbling fence, and a small hill that once held nothing but blackberry thickets and fox dens. By early summer, the sign was gone, replaced by surveyor flags and orange markers driven into the dirt like small neon warnings. No one said anything to him directly, but he noticed the changes immediately. Trucks came, first white, spotless, humming with new money, then men in hard hats who spoke in clipped, efficient tones and waved papers when they passed him at the property line. They never looked him in the eye, just nodded, moved along. The dog watched them all, never barking, never pacing, just watching. A week later, the couple arrived, too well dressed for the dust, too confident for the quiet. She wore clean sneakers and a visor. He wore a shirt too tight for digging, but perfect for drone footage. They parked their SUV close to the road and took turns posing near the old fence post. The one leaning under decades of weight and moss, a real estate agent followed behind them with a clipboard, smiling too wide, saying too many things. They didn't wave, not at first, just stood with their backs to his land, talking loudly about views and upgrades, about space and potential. When they finally noticed the crooked farmhouse in the distance, the man shaded his eyes and pointed. The woman tilted her head and said something he couldn't hear, but her smile disappeared. They looked at the house like it was a problem to be solved, not a neighbor to meet. He stayed on his porch, didn't react, just rocked gently in the chair with the splintered armrest. The dog lay beside him, head raised, ears alert. By July, earth movers had begun clearing the hill. Trees came down one by one, pines, birches, and a few old oaks that had stood longer than either of the new owners had been alive. The machines pushed them into piles, roots exposed and limbs broken like bones. The noise started before dawn and went long after dusk. Even when the work paused, the drone of progress lingered. The kind of hum that doesn't come from machines, but from people who think they're building something important. They called it a retreat. A modern farmhouse, they said, with minimalist lines and intentional contrast. Concrete walls, glass walkways, and solar panels that caught the sun like polished armor. It rose quickly to quickly framing out in weeks, roofed in days, and wrapped in black sheeting that shimmered in the heat like oil. The woman posted updates online. Phrases like sustainable living, our forever home, and rural. Resets stacked under photos of bare studs and gravel paths. They began clearing beyond the property line without asking. Just a few feet at first, then more. A section of his fence vanished one morning. When he walked the perimeter and saw the tracks, the markers, the soil turned where it shouldn't be. He didn't shout, he didn't knock on their door. He simply replaced the post. Taller this time, painted red. The next morning, it was gone again. At the hardware store, people whispered. Said the couple had money from the city. Said they planned to host yoga retreats, weddings, and events. Said they were pushing for new zoning to pave the road past the ridge. One of the construction workers let slip that the couple had been overheard joking about the old guy with the dog and the spooky stare. He heard it. He heard all of it. The woman approached him once late afternoon, sun behind her, casting her face in a kind of glow she probably thought was charming. She wore sunglasses and a half-apologetic smile. Said something about community, about shared spaces, about creating beauty together. He nodded once, slow, then turned and walked back to the porch. The dog followed. She stood there a while longer, then left without another word. From then on, they didn't try again. But they didn't stop either. They moved closer, cleared more, dug deeper, as if the land would forget its lines if they erased them long enough. As if the man who lived at the edge didn't matter, because his house wasn't new and his voice wasn't loud. But the land remembered, and so did he. The bell above the door at Lester's feed, and grain clanged twice when he walked in. Same boots, same coat, same dog. The wooden floor creaked, like always. The old clock by the counter ticked a little louder than it needed to. 3 men by the seed bins paused mid-sentence. Not startled, just quieted. That's how it always went when he showed up. Ruckus sat by the door like he always did, alert, but still, his leather collar resting against his thick neck. The dog's eyes followed the men in the corner, not with suspicion, but with the weight. Of memory, like he already knew what they would say next. The man gave a nod to Lester behind the counter. No words, just a tap on the feed list, and Lester marked it down without asking. Doesn't say much. One of the younger workers muttered when the man passed by. His voice wasn't loud, but in that quiet room, nothing stayed hidden. Another man elbowed him lightly, not to hush him, but just enough to warn. The old man didn't turn around. He never did. But that didn't mean he didn't hear. Outside, the wind tugged at the faded flags along the feed trough. The couple building the modern farmhouse had come in the day before, asking about bulk seed and rainwater systems as if farming was something you could do on solar batteries and vision boards. They'd talked loud enough that half the store heard their opinions on property values, and that veteran guy next door, now the whispers moved like dust through cracked windows, never direct. Always tilted through opinion and memory. Nobody claimed to know exactly what branch he'd served in. Army, maybe? Some said Special Forces. One of the older men, Warren, claimed he once saw him disarm a man in the diner with a napkin and a fork. No one could verify it, but no one laughed. Either heard he buried something out there. Someone muttered near the hay bales. Not a body, equipment. Military-grade stuff. Old radios, munitions, stuff from the Cold War. Cold War thought he was in Afghanistan, someone else countered. Could have been both, came the reply. He's old enough. Some guys went back in later years, contractors. Quiet work, not the kind that makes newspapers. Heard he doesn't sleep. Walks the fields at night. Dog stays at his side the whole time. Some kid tried to film it once. Drone got fried midair. Lester cleared his throat behind the counter. Not a warning, just enough to say they'd gone far enough. The room shifted. Talk turned to prices and water lines. But the weight of what they'd said hung above the counter like an unspoken flag. No one denied that the man had changed after the war, whichever war it had been. Some said he used to smile, used to have a wife who brought pies to town meetings. Others swore the only woman they ever saw on that porch was a VA nurse who left in tears one afternoon. The man had never raised his voice in town, never started a fight. But one time, when a local drunk pushed him outside the post office, he stepped aside without a word. The man tripped on nothing, broke his wrist. Later claimed it was the wind. PTSD, someone whispered once, not out of pity, but out of habit-like. It was the only explanation anyone ever needed to stop asking questions. There were stories about what he did when the fireworks started each 4th of July, how he never complained, never called. But some said they saw him in the field after midnight, standing still with his back to the lights, shoulders locked, dog sitting perfectly still beside him. Others said he dug trenches just deep enough to sleep in when the noise got too close. Nobody knew if it was true, but the stories grew. They said he kept journals, locked in a trunk under his bed, wrote down names, coordinates, dates. They said his barn had an old radio system patched together from decades of surplus, and sometimes, in the middle of the night, it clicked on by itself. Morse code, static, a voice no one recognized saying numbers that didn't make sense. Whether it was true or not, no one dared find out. He paid his bills, fixed his own fence, showed up when it mattered, quiet and steady, and for most of the town, that was enough to leave him alone. But the newcomers weren't from town, and they didn't believe in whispers. It happened just after 10 a.m. on a Tuesday that smelled of cut grass and hot oil. The sun was already high, casting hard shadows along the ridge where the old fence stretched, worn and leaning, but still standing. Built by hand by his father and grandfather before him, it had marked the edge of the McClendon land for 70 years. Oak posts, iron nails, and wire twisted with a tension that had lasted far longer than anyone expected. Time had bent it, but never broken it until now. The rumble started low, more vibration than sound, the kind of tremor that animals feel before people do. Ruckus lifted his head from the porch floor before the noise reached the house. The old man stood slowly, shielding his eyes as the dust rose beyond the tree line. He didn't need binoculars. The shape of the machine was clear even from a distance, yellow heavy, wide as a cabin. It was a bulldozer, and it wasn't on the new owner's land. There had been no notice, no calls, no permits posted, just the engine growling louder as it advanced across the clearing like a challenge. Two men walked alongside it, one holding a clipboard, the other talking into a phone with the distracted ease of someone who thought everything around him could be bought or moved. They didn't even glance at the fence as it neared. The driver didn't slow. With one push of the blade, the first post went down, sheared off at the base like a twig under a boot. The wire snapped with a metallic twang that echoed across the pasture. By the time the old man reached the edge of his property, 20 feet of the fence was gone. He didn't shout, didn't wave his arms. He just stood in the shade of the cottonwood tree, hands at his sides, back straight. The driver saw him, then hesitated for a breath, but the man with the clipboard barked something and pointed forward. The bulldozer kept moving. Another post fell, then another. Ruckus growled, low and steady. The old man put a hand on the dogs. Back, no need. Not yet. One of the workers broke off from the group and walked over. A younger guy, maybe mid-30s, button-down shirt to clean for someone pretending to belong on a job site. He didn't introduce himself, just nodded toward the house. We're clearing for the drainage line. Part of the redesign. Should have been flagged on the survey. The old man didn't respond. The worker shifted his weight. Our engineer says the property line runs about 10 feet inside your fence. Could be off a little, but we'll make adjustments after the gradings. Done? You'll get a letter. Still nothing. Look, sir, we're not trying to cause trouble, the man said, glancing nervously at the dog. We're just under contract to finish site prep this week. I'm sure the owners will be happy to talk later if there's the old man raised one hand, just a small motion, enough to make the worker stop mid-sentence. Then he turned, walked back to the porch, and disappeared inside the house. By evening, the bulldozer was gone, but so was the fence. Over 100 feet of it reduced to splinters and twisted metal. The crew hadn't stayed long. Something had changed mid-afternoon. The man with the clipboard had made a call, stood stiff while listening, then gave a quiet signal. Engines shut down. Workers packed up. No explanations were given. Later that night, a low humming could be heard coming from the barn. A rhythmic pulse, mechanical and steady. The light in the loft flickered once, then stayed on. Some in town said they saw something in the sky above the ridge, just a flicker, a shimmer, and then silence. At dawn, a new post stood where the first had been knocked down, taller than the old one, sharper, driven deep into the earth with precision that didn't come from old tools. No wire yet, just the post, standing alone like a warning. The newcomers didn't drive their machines past that point again, not for a while. The sound came again, metal against earth, a long grinding drag that set every nerve on edge. He stood in the middle of his field, rake in hand, watching the tree line without blinking. The new neighbors were working again, grading or trenching. Maybe they hadn't said what for, and he hadn't asked, but he could hear the steel teeth chewing into the ground like it owed them something. The noise didn't just stay on their side. It carried, crawled under his skin, settled deep in the soft tissue behind his ribs. He lowered the rake without realizing. His right hand trembled not from age, but from recognition. Somewhere under the hum of the machine, another sound returned, one he hadn't heard in years. Not here, not in this country. A worry buzz of radio static, the dull thump of a distant blast, the metallic groan of armored doors being forced open. He dropped to one, need not fast, not dramatic, just slow enough to let the memory come through without toppling him. His dog was at his side instantly, silent, leaning into his hip with that practiced awareness. Ruckus had been trained for this. Years ago, back when the VA had still funded programs that mattered, he tried to steady his breath. Inhale, 4. Hold, 4. Exhale, 4. He'd been taught the drill, but his body didn't want oxygen, it wanted cover. It wanted the dirt to be deeper, the air thicker, the world smaller. He could still see the faces. Brown uniforms, tan sand, eyes wide. Some boys, some old before they had the right to be. All of them waiting for something, orders, confirmation. An explosion, waiting. The field in front of him blurred. He remembered crouching behind a stone wall outside Kandahar, his boot wedged under a broken pipe to keep balance as artillery hit 2 ridgelines over. He could still smell the oil in the air, hot and slick, could still feel the tremor that traveled up through his knees when the tank fired. Back then, the scrape of metal was a countdown. Always meant something was coming. Next shells, screams, silence. Now, the sound was just a neighbor's contractor with too much equipment and not enough respect. But his body didn't know the difference. The field rolled with heat waves, summer light bending the horizon. He stood slowly, wiping one hand against his pants, though there was no sweat. His other hand clenched the rake handle until the knuckles went pale. He stared at the distant treetops, not looking at anything in particular, but tracking movement anyway, muscle memory still intact. Voices carried over the hill, laughter, someone giving instructions, someone else revving an engine. He turned, back toward the barn, but not in retreat. He walked like he always did, measured, quiet, aware. At the door, he paused, rested one hand on the old iron latch, the other on the dog's head. Ruckus didn't move, just waited. Inside. The barn smelled of hay, old metal, and oil-stained wood. He stepped past the hanging tools, past the row of seed bags, to the far wall where the floorboard didn't creak like the others. He moved it without effort. Beneath was a small metal box, the kind that locked without needing a key. He opened it and removed a folded cloth the size of a scarf. Inside was a photo for men, dusty and half-smiling, seated on crates with rifles slung. Behind them, all gone now. Next to the photo was a small, battered radio, not hooked to anything, just kept. He stared at it for a long moment, then folded the cloth back up and returned everything to its place, covered the compartment, pressed it down. Outside, the metal scraped again, closer this time. His memory was sharp, not just of war, but of what came after. The meetings, the cold-eyed officials, the way they taught him to listen differently to distinguish noise from signal, and the scraping now. That wasn't just noise. Something was digging too close to something that wasn't meant to be found. It started with laughter, high-pitched, reckless, the kind that comes just before someone crosses a line they don't fully understand. He heard it before he saw them, 3 teenagers in designer hoodies and clean white sneakers, too new to belong to the land they were trampling. They moved like they owned the place, cutting through tall grass that hadn't been touched in years, pushing through rows of corn without care, stepping over boundary lines that were once respected without question. One of them carried a can of spray paint. Another filmed everything on a phone held at arm's length. The third dragged a tattered scarecrow by one limp arm, its head bobbing with every step, straw leaking from the torn shirt. From the porch, he watched. Didn't move. Ruckus stood beside him, ears forward, tail still. The dog didn't growl, didn't bark, just waited. The kids made their way to the southern field, his least visible corner, where the wooden signs still stood. Black lettering, worn by time but legible. Restricted zone. Military easement. Trespassing not advised. Most people took one look and turned around. These boys didn't. They posed in front of the signs, laughed louder. The one with the can sprayed a neon smiley face over the word restricted. The one with the phone narrated it like a game show. Here we are, exploring the old vet's backyard. He says it's military land. Let's see if he shows up in a tank. The third boy, the one with the scarecrow, didn't talk much, just smiled in that wide, shallow way some kids learn too young. He jammed the scarecrow's wooden spine into the dirt, then took a Sharpie from his pocket and scrawled something on the chest. From the porch, it was too far to read, but the boy laughed hard, bent over, hands on knees, like he'd said something worth remembering. He shouldn't have touched the signs. The wind shifted. The corn husks rustled, but not from wind. A low buzzing sound began, almost like static, barely audible over the boy's laughter. Then it changed. Something clicked in the distance, mechanical and deliberate. A movement behind the tree line, not loud, but clear. The boy with the phone lowered it. Did you hear that? The one with the spray can turned. What was the scarecrow shifted. Not much, just a tilt. Its head, knocked loose earlier, now leaned unnaturally far to the side. A crow landed on the post beside it, then screeched once before flapping away as if burned. The third boy stepped back, Then another step, then stopped laughing entirely. From the porch, he watched them freeze. One of the signs, the one closest to the ground, had a loose wire running underneath. It buried, barely visible, part of something older. Something that had once signaled motion. It was still functional, still connected. The boy with the scarecrow suddenly stumbled forward, not tripped-pushed, but no one had touched him. He landed hard in the dirt, hands out scraped his palms. When he sat up, his face had changed. Whatever he saw in that moment, whatever his eyes had caught behind the signpost or beyond the edge of the field, it took something from him. The laughter never came back. The other two helped him up. Their filming stopped, their voices quieted. They moved quickly after that. No more commentary, no more jokes. They didn't go back for the scarecrow. They didn't look behind them. They just ran, sneakers kicking up dust as they vanished over the ridgeline. The old man didn't leave the porch. He didn't have to. The scarecrow remained where it had been, planted head tilted, face now smeared with something darker than paint. The word scrawled across its chest, now clearer in the falling light. Traitor. He waited until nightfall before he walked down to remove it. Not because he was afraid, but because the message hadn't been for him. It had been for whoever was watching. The barn had always been quiet. Weathered by time and storm, it stood hunched at the back of his property like an old sentinel half-swallowed by brush, its boards silvered from sun and wind. For decades, the place barely stirred. The doors stayed shut. No hay deliveries, no livestock, no engine sounds, just stillness. But then the light began staying on. At first, it was subtle, a faint glow behind the high slatted window on the eastern wall, pale yellow, warm, like an old filament bulb refusing to die. Most people didn't notice. A passing driver might have caught it for a second, a flicker through the trees, and thought nothing of it. But those who lived nearby, those who watched started to talk about old Mrs. Callahan on the hill behind the feed mill, mentioned it first at church. She said she hadn't seen the barn go dark in over a week, claimed she woke up every night around 2 and glanced out her bedroom window habit, mostly, and there it was. The light, steady and unblinking, glowing like an eye that refused to close. Others brushed it off. Maybe he'd taken up woodwork. Maybe he just couldn't sleep. The man was a veteran, after all. People like him didn't always settle easily. But the longer the light stayed on, the more people began to wonder. And then came the shadows. They weren't clear, just faint movements seen from a distant shapes crossing behind the window, bending low, sometimes disappearing for hours, only to reappear in quick, deliberate flashes. A figure pacing, sometimes still, sometimes stooped over a table. No music, no voices, just silence and that unrelenting yellow glow. Teenagers dared each other to get closer. One night, 2 of them parked at the end of the gravel road and walked toward the edge of the property, whispering like they were breaking into a tomb. They didn't get far. Ruckus met them before the halfway point, silent and still in the middle of the path. Not barking, not advancing, just standing, watching the boys turn back. Rumors started to swirl again, like they always did when something didn't sit right. One man claimed the barn light was infrared, the kind only visible with night vision goggles. Another said he heard Morse code being tapped through the soil, though no one could explain how that would work. A teenager posted a shaky video online, 30 seconds of static, a distant light, and a shape that moved too quickly across the frame. It got taken down by morning, then someone noticed the footprints, not boot prints, not tire marks, but lines of disturbed earth, too wide for animals, to clean for wind. Tracks that led from the barn to the edge of the fields parallel to the old military signs, as if something had been dragged or rolled. No one could tell. The prints vanished after the morning rain, but they returned the next night in different places. The old man didn't answer questions. Not that anyone dared ask. He still came into town twice a week, same jacket, same boots, same silence. At the diner, he sat by the window, drank his coffee, eyes distant. He didn't smile. But he didn't look angry either, just focused, like someone counting time. One night, a neighbor across the ridge swore they saw something larger emerge from the barn covered in tarp, wheeled, guided by hand or something else. The light flickered once that night, just once, then stayed steady. Again, whatever was happening in that barn, it wasn't hobby work. It wasn't some idle project to keep an old man busy. He was preparing, And the land, once quiet and slow, felt charged, now like it remembered something buried deep. The barn didn't creak anymore. It buzzed, low and rhythmic, like a pulse or a timer. Ruckus moved like he had always belonged to the land, not like a pet, not even like a soldier's companion, but something older, something wired into the bones of the earth. He wasn't large, but he felt large. Thick black fur, streaked with gray along the snout eyes that didn't blink too often, and a steady way of walking that made people slow down when he passed. There was a scar along his left shoulder, hair grown uneven over it, the kind that comes not from accident, but from survival. Most assumed he was just a retired service dog, and that was true technically, but the collar told a different story. It wasn't store-bought, not leather for fashion or vanity. It was military shoe custom cut, dark and worn, stamped with a symbol no one recognized. Not a name, not even a tag, just an insignia pressed deep into the hide, a winged arrow crossed with a gear. Those who noticed it usually didn't ask. The few who did never got an answer. Ruckus never barked. He didn't need to. The quiet carried more weight. He watched everything, not like a curious dog, but like a sentry. He observed hands, not faces, feet, not smiles. He noticed who approached with confidence and who with doubt, especially those who laughed too loud. There was something about noise that didn't sit right with him, the forced kind, the laughter that covered tension. He could pick it out, even from across a field. When the construction crews from the new development started bringing in younger workers' jokers, loud talkers, men who treated the land like an inconvenience, Ruckus took notice. The first time they laughed near the fence line, he was in the field before the echo faded, just standing still, watching. The men didn't see him at first. One of them made a crude joke about the haunted veteran and his ghost dog. The second man laughed harder. That's when they turned and saw him 30 feet away, motionless, head slightly tilted. They didn't finish their conversation. No threats were made, no teeth were shown, but something in the air shifted. The men returned to their truck early that day. After that, they stayed quieter near the ridge. He followed the old man everywhere, but not like a shadow. He walked ahead, sometimes or alongside, like he was deciding the route. At the hardware store, he waited without being told. At the diner, he curled beneath the table, still as stone, his nose facing the door. If someone unfamiliar walked too close, Ruckus would lift his head not aggressively, but with the kind of alertness that made people second-guess stepping forward. Once a real estate agent tried to deliver a stack of papers to the front door, the dog met her halfway up the steps. She froze, smiled nervously, tried talking in that high, sweet tone people use when they don't want to admit they're afraid. Ruckus didn't growl. He didn't move. He just looked at her until she backed away, muttering that she'd leave the papers with the office. Instead, no one had ever trained Ruckus to intimidate. He didn't need that kind of command. What he'd learned came from long before, when noises meant bombs and smells meant danger. And laughter didn't always mean safety. At night, he circled the property line without prompting. A quiet loop through the grass, always the same path, once around. Pause at the barn, look back at the house, then settle on the porch beside the rocker. Locals whispered that the dog had once taken down a man twice his size in silence, that a government official had tried to scan his collar and the reader fried, that he understood not just words, but intentions. None of it was confirmed, but no one tested it either. Ruckus didn't play fetch. He didn't chew toys. He didn't wag, unless it was for the old man, and even then, it was subtle, just a twitch of the tail, a lift of the ears. He wasn't just a dog, he was a memory made flesh, a companion to things unspoken, a last line drawn not in sand, but in silence. The drone took off just after noon, one of the new estate's latest additions. It buzzed into the air from a sleek black pad near the main house, its wings humming a high-pitched whir that cut across the sky like a mosquito on caffeine. It rose, quickly, hovered, then tilted forward and zipped east, its camera eye blinking red, scanning everything beneath it with the wide indifference of artificial precision. The young couple had brought it in the week before, citing perimeter monitoring and wildlife awareness, but anyone watching knew it was for something else. They wanted to see, not just the land they bought, but the land next to it, the land that wouldn't sell, the land where the man and his dog still lived like the world had never moved on. No, one saw the drone cross the property line, not officially. There were no clear boundaries anymore, just vague recollections and quiet respect that most locals still observed, even when the maps didn't. But the drone didn't pause. It dipped low over the ridge, skimmed the tree line, and vanished into the space where the barn light never went out. 15 minutes passed, then 20, then a full hour from the back patio of the estate house. The young man squinted at his tablet screen, trying to refresh the feed. The display showed static, then black, then nothing. His fingers tapped against the glass like that might change something. His wife stood behind him, arms folded, eyes narrow. She didn't ask where it went. She just watched the trees dot by evening. The drone still hadn't returned. No alert, no crash signal, no low battery ping. It was just gone. 2 days later, the boy from the hardware store saw something deep in the woods behind the feed mill. He hadn't meant to go that far. His job was to clear brush and stack pallets, but his curiosity got the better of him. The drone, after all, was worth nearly $8,000, and rumor said the owners might offer a reward. He followed a faint path, past the stream into the thicker trees where the leaves filtered sunlight into shards of green and gold. That's where he found it. The wreckage wasn't large. A scattering of melted plastic, scorched aluminum, and a camera lens cracked clean down the middle. It sat in a shallow ditch beneath an ash tree. The earth around it blackened in a perfect circle, no fire. No smoke, just a strange singe-like. Something had heated the air and pressed it downward. The boy didn't touch it. He took one photo, zoomed in twice, then backed away by the next morning. The wreckage was gone. No one claimed to have removed it. The couple never mentioned it. The boy didn't show the photo around town, but word spread anyway, like it always did, quietly across counters, in the slow pauses between checkout beeps. In the long silences of porch sitting, one man said he'd seen a flash over the ridge that night, a quick burst of light that came and went without sound. Another swore he heard a hum near the woods, low and rhythmic like a generator buried underground. Nobody said anything official, but a week later, the estate hired a different drone company. They used a new model, bigger, more expensive. It launched once, stayed over their land, and never ventured close to the fence again. Some things didn't need to be said. The old man never looked up during any of it. He stayed by the porch, the barn, the field moving slow but sure, the dog at his side, calm, UNBOTHERED. But that evening, just before sunset, a neighbor driving past noticed something odd. The old man stood at the edge of his property, hands behind his back, staring out toward the woods. At his feet, half buried in the dirt, was a small black rotor blade. The sound of gravel crunching beneath his boots was the only thing that broke the silence. No cicadas, no wind, just the steady rhythm of his steps as he moved along the property line. The dim yellow beam of his flashlight sweeping low across the weeds and fence posts. It was past midnight. The world around him slept, but he never did. Not completely. The journal was tucked under his arm, leather-bound, cracked at the spine, the corners soft from years of opening and closing in haste. He paused near the eastern boundary, where the fence had once been taken down, and hastily rebuilt, he shone the light over the new posts, still upright, still untouched since the last time. He knelt and ran one hand along the base of the nearest one, fingers searching for pressure, for change, for anything that felt off. Then he stood, clicked the flashlight off, and stood in stillness for exactly 30 seconds. It was always 30. Then, he opened the journal and wrote something with deliberate care. The ink was black, the handwriting exact, almost military in its neatness. The line he drew across the page cut clean through the date. He marked a circle near the top margin, a pattern of some kind. He didn't check back to earlier entries. He remembered everything he always did, from the back side of the property. The barn light hummed faintly, casting an amber glow onto the nearest patch of earth. It wasn't a bright light. It didn't need to be. The old man could see well enough in the dark. What the light did was announce, this place is watched, this place is known, this place remembers. He turned back toward the western tree line, toward the ridge where the new neighbor's security lights sometimes flickered unnecessarily. They weren't on tonight, not visibly, but he still paused, There had been a new sound earlier that evening, a hollow, distant click at 9:37 p.m., too sharp for an animal, too subtle for machinery. It had come from the direction of the solar field the couple had installed 2 weeks prior. He'd marked it down already, but now he returned to the spot with slow, deliberate steps. He reached a bare patch of earth near the tree line and crouched again, brushing aside some leaves. The moon was high now, full enough to give shape to everything. He didn't use the flashlight here. He didn't need it. The soil had been disturbed barely, just enough that someone unfamiliar might miss it. But his eye knew difference. Knew when something didn't match its own memory. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, round object. A rusted washer, nothing more. He placed it on the ground next to the disturbed soil, then opened the journal again. Another mark, another date. A second circle beside the first. It wasn't just record-keeping. It was confirmation. Years ago, someone told him the war was over, that he could rest, that the noise had stopped and the threats were gone. But that was for people who slept in clean houses, with curtains pulled tight, and televisions that never lost signal. The war didn't end. It changed. It got quieter, more subtle, less about weapons and more about presence lines crossed without stepping, questions asked without speaking. He turned slowly, scanning the darkness with calm eyes, not paranoid, not afraid, just ready. He had survived places where the ground whispered back, where metal doors shook in the windless heat, where radios clicked alive without warning. And those lessons didn't disappear just because the uniforms changed or the paperwork said retired. No, he still walked. Every night, same route, same routine, and every time they tested him stepping too close, scanning too long, flying too low, he added another mark in the journal, a quiet warning to himself. And to them, he passed the barn again. Flashlight off now, the light overhead casting long shadows across the grass. Ruckus joined him from behind the water tank, silently falling into step. They finished the loop together, moving like a unit, still trained, still watching. By the time they reached the porch, dawn was beginning to stain the sky with its slow gray light. He closed the journal. The night had said enough. The old sheriff's cruiser pulled into the gravel lot behind the diner, its engine ticking as it cooled under the rising sun. Deputy Curtis Madsen stepped out slowly, stiff from the weight of the belt and the years. He adjusted his cap, gave a slow glance around the quiet street, then walked through the back door like he always did in no ceremony, just habit. Inside, the morning shift had just started. Coffee brewing, booths mostly empty. A few regulars lifted their hands in greeting. Curtis nodded, said nothing. He found him in the usual booth, back corner, facing the window. Same jacket, same coffee, same silence. The dog lay beneath the table like a coiled shadow, unmoving. Curtis didn't sit right away. He placed his hand gently on the top of the chair across from him and waited. The old man gave the faintest nod. Colonel Curtis said, quiet but clear. It wasn't a greeting. It was a recognition, a line drawn in memory that no one else in town crossed. Most people barely knew the man's name, but Curtis did, and he knew better than to use it. The old man didn't look up at first. He reached for the sugar packet, stirred once, then finally spoke without looking. Morning, Sergeant. Curtis smiled a little, not out of humor, but out of something closer to reverence. That title wasn't his anymore, hadn't been for decades. But when the colonel said it, it felt real again. They sat like that for a while, the space between them filled with a quiet understanding that only comes from shared history. Not friendship, not even brotherhood, something simpler. They had both seen things they never spoke about, and that silence connected them more than words ever could. You hear about the drone? Curtis asked eventually. The colonel didn't answer right away. He reached for his cup, took a slow sip. Then it crossed a line. Curtis nodded. He didn't ask which line. He didn't need to. He'd seen the wreckage too. Maybe not with his own eyes, but he knew where to look and what to look for. He'd been out to that ridge the morning after it vanished, saw the scorched patch of ground, smelled the ozone in the air, felt the shift in pressure that always followed an unspoken message. They're pushing, Curtis said. Testing, they always do. Curtis glanced around the diner before leaning. In slightly, that couple, next-door developers, influencers, whatever they are, they've got lawyers sniffing around the courthouse, zoning, easements, property tax records, stuff that don't belong to them. The colonel didn't react. Curtis lowered his voice. One of them asked about your discharge file. Wanted to know if you were legally sound enough to hold land in your name. Now the colonel looked up. Not fast, just enough for his eyes to meet Curtis's calm. Cold, clear, do they know who you are? Larkers asked. More as a whisper than a question, no. They think you're just some stubborn old farmer. I am, he said flatly, but not only Curtis. Let that sit, he remembered. He remembered the footage, the grainy black and white clips from the briefing room. Not the ones they showed on television, the classified ones. The ones with no sound and timestamps that didn't exist in any official record. He remembered watching the colonel walk through a hostile compound like he belonged there, clearing hallways with a precision that didn't shake or hesitate. No unit patch, no helmet, just focus. Curtis leaned back. You still have the journal? Yes, you're marking it. Yes, you got a plan. There was no answer, but Curtis didn't need one. He stood slowly, gave a final nod, then rested a hand on the table knot to steady himself. But to signal something else. If they go further, he said, you call me. The colonel met his eyes again. Just for a second. If they go further, he said, you won't need a call. Curtis left without another word. Outside, the cruiser door closed with a dull click. The sun had risen fully now, spilling light across the ridge and the fields beyond. The war never ended, but some men carried it well. Quietly, thoroughly, and only a few still knew what that meant. The music started just after dark, low thuds of bass rippling through the still country air like distant thunder. It didn't belong out here, not among the trees and wheat and silence, but it pressed in anyway. By the time the sky turned black and the stars tried to reclaim the land, the laughter had already begun. Too loud, too sharp. Forced in that particular way people use when they're trying to impress each other and don't care who hears them. The developers had invited a dozen friends from the city. Professionals with polished boots that never touched dirt, voices that didn't lower out of respect for the land they stood on. They gathered around a fire pit near the edge of the property. Flames rising high, fueled not by old timber, but store-bought logs stacked like decoration. String lights were strung between poles. Someone had set up speakers on tripods. Bluetooth synced playlist curated. The man across the fence didn't move. He sat in his rocker as usual. A wool blanket over his knees, journal open but untouched. Ruckus lay at his side, ears twitching now and then. Not asleep, but not tense. Either the sound of laughter rolled in waves, shouts, glass clinking, the sudden, unmistakable pop of a champagne cork, and then the microphone crackled to life. One of the guests, a man in a salmon pink shirt and gleaming white sneakers, stood near the fire with a plastic cup in one hand and the mic in the other. Drunk, confident, looking for attention. He held the mic like a stand-up comic, elbow bent, shoulder cocked. So, he said, drawing out the word as the crowd settled into a half circle. Has anyone met the neighbor yet? Polite laughter? No? You'll know him when you see him. He's the one in full camouflage with the haunted stare and the murder barn. Louder laughter now. Someone clapped. I heard he sleeps with a bayonet. I'm not even kidding. Like Dudier. Not in Fallujah anymore. It's over. More laughter, less polite this time. The speaker grinned, swaying slightly. Guys out there walking the fence line every night like he's gonna catch a Taliban hiding in the hedgerow? The mic buzzed as someone whooped. Let's just hope he doesn't mistake one of us for a scarecrow. Don't want to end up in his incident report. The man used air quotes. Grinning back at the farmhouse, the old man turned the page in his journal. He didn't flinch, didn't sigh, didn't shift his weight. He simply made a mark in the margin, a small square drawn next to the date, then set the pen down beside him. The lights from the estate glowed just beyond the tree line, too bright, too artificial. They washed out the stars. The laughter kept rising, peaking at unpredictable intervals, like a wave that didn't know when to crash. At one point, a drone lifted briefly into the air, spun once, then dropped back down. A party trick. More applause. Ruckus. Stood not fast, not aggressive, just slow and certain. He padded toward the edge of the porch and sat facing the trees, head low, gaze steady. The old man followed with his eyes, then reached down and ran one hand along the dog's back. No words, just contact. Back at the fire, the voices began to blur. The jokes got louder, sloppier. A woman yelled something about haunted cornfields. A man followed up with a fake growl and limped through the grass, pretending to be a shell-shocked ghost. They laughed harder. No one noticed the trees going still. No one noticed how the wind shifted directions, or how the barn light across the field blinked once, then stayed steady again. The microphone finally cut out on its own. The party kept going, but by morning, half the string lights had gone out. No one remembered unplugging them. The mic was missing. 2 of the guests claimed they saw something move behind the ridge, something low and fast and black. They didn't report it. They didn't come back the next weekend either. It arrived just after dawn, before the sun had fully burned through the low clouds stretched across the hills. The kind of morning where the dew clung longer and the quiet felt heavier, like the land itself was bracing for something. The sound came first faint, then rising, not the chopping thud of a news chopper or the low rumble of a crop duster. This was different, a deeper hum, controlled, precise. By the time most of the town was still inside, making coffee or reaching for the day's first task, it was already there, hovering, a matte black helicopter, small and clean, no visible markings, no tail insignia, nothing to say where it had come from or who had sent it. It circled once, then hovered directly above the southern edge of the colonel's property, not close enough to be aggressive, not far enough to be casual. He was already outside. He hadn't been asleep. He never was. Not fully. He stood near the barn, one hand resting on the handle of a wheelbarrow that held nothing but soil. The dog, Ruckus, sat by his side, ears up, body still. They both watched. The helicopter didn't descend, didn't signal. It simply hung in the air like a question suspended in metal and noise. The colonel didn't wave, didn't gesture. But he reached into his jacket and pulled out something smaller, round tin, old and battered, the paint nearly gone. He opened it and removed a single piece of cloth, no larger than a pocket square. It was folded 4 times, precise creases from years of being untouched. He held it in both hands, unfolded it once, then let it hang from his palm. It was a triangle of deep green fabric. No writing, no flag, just one color military, deliberate. The shade meant something, though not to everyone. The helicopter drifted slightly to the left, repositioning itself. The movement was minimal. Careful, inside, someone was watching through a lens, someone who likely didn't live anywhere near this place, someone who had been told who this man was and instructed to confirm without engagement. The colonel held the cloth steady for 15 seconds, then folded it again. The helicopter didn't move immediately. It stayed exactly where it was, blades slicing the still air with unchanging rhythm. Then, as quietly as it had come, it pulled back. No spin, no stuttered, just a smooth retreat. It rose higher, circled once in a wide arc, then disappeared beyond. The ridge. No one in the town mentioned it. Most didn't even know it had happened. The diner was quiet that morning. The feed store opened late. The developer's house stayed dark for longer than usual. A few people claimed they heard something in the sky, but didn't look up. One teenager swore he caught it on his phone's camera, but the footage was grainy, and his friends didn't care enough to watch it twice. Back at the farm, the colonel walked slowly back toward the barn. The cloth returned to the tin tucked into his jacket. He set the wheelbarrow down by the west wall, next to the line of posts he'd been digging the week before. He picked up a shovel, began again. There was no urgency in his movements, no fear. His ears twitched once more, then flattened. The journal wouldn't need a new page, just a mark. Small, meaningful. The first helicopter had come. He didn't expect it to be the last. The morning was still and unusually warm for late October. The fog hadn't yet lifted from the low fields, and the air smelled of wet hay and old wood. The mailbox at the edge of the gravel path groaned as he opened it, the rusted hinge complaining, like it always did. Most days, it held nothing but circulars and unwanted catalogs, sometimes nothing at all. But today, there was an envelope, plain white, no stamp, no postmark, no return address, just his name printed neatly in the center. No title, no rank, just the name they used before he wore a uniform. He didn't open it right away. He didn't bring it back inside. He stood by the fence post near the path, dog at his side, and turned the envelope over once. Then again, his fingers knew how to feel for pressure, extra layers, metal edges, adhesives. It was thin, 2 items at most. No sound when he shook it, no indentation on the paper to suggest writing. He slid a gloved finger under the flap and peeled it. Open. Inside 2 things. A photograph, slightly yellowed with age, thick with the glossy sheen of older prints, and a small folded slip of paper no larger than a matchbox. He held the photograph first. He didn't have to look twice. It was him. Taken from the right side, the beret tilted just slightly back on his head, a strip of dirt across his jaw. The angle was familiar. He remembered the man who took it. 1986, somewhere in Kandahar province, a temporary outpost built from nothing but sandbags and wire. He hadn't seen this particular photo before, but he remembered that moment. He remembered the day the air had been so dry his lips cracked in silence. The night before, they'd lost one of their youngest. No words were spoken at the time, just a nod, a look, the stillness of shared understanding. This photo had been taken only hours after. There were no markings on the back. He set the photo aside and carefully unfolded the slip of paper, printed in tiny black ink, center aligned, was a single set of coordinates. No preamble, no explanation. 34.6510 and 69.8665 E high. Didn't need to look them up. He knew. The numbers were carved into his memory like a scar beneath skin. That stretch of earth had once held something buried in. Improvised forward command point 1. Built in a rush during a 2-day push through a hostile corridor. There had been no satellite image of it then, no digital map, and yet here it was, precise to the 4th decimal. He folded the paper slowly and placed both items back into the envelope. Then he stared out at the field, empty, soft with early fog, gently swaying under the windless sky. No one should have had this photo. Not civilians, not lawyers, not neighbors. It was taken with a military-issued Leica, one of only 3 in the unit. The roll of film was supposed to be burned when the outpost was abandoned. If someone had it now, that meant they'd either gone looking where they shouldn't, or they had never stopped watching. He didn't feel threatened. Not exactly, but something else stirred, something older than fear. Recognition. He walked back to the porch slowly, carrying the envelope as though it were heavier than it looked. Ruckus stayed behind at the fence, ears forward. Tracking the wind out inside the house, the journal lay open on the kitchen table. He placed the envelope beside it and opened to a clean page. No heading, no commentary, just the coordinates. He wrote them once, then again, on the line below. Then he added a square around the second entry. He reached for the radio, next one, rarely used, battery always charged. He clicked through the frequencies slowly, not broadcasting, just listening. There was nothing yet, but the envelope hadn't arrived by chance. Someone had delivered it. Someone who knew where the line used. To be and that, it had just been crossed. The boy waited until near dusk, when the sky turned to soft orange and shadows stretched long across the fields. He came on foot, his bike hidden behind the line of poplars near the service road. His hoodie was pulled low, and he kept looking over his shoulder, though no one had followed him. He held the note in his pocket, creased, folded 3 times, written in ink that had smeared from his own hesitation. 5 lines, that was all. Just 5 lines to try and undo what he and the others had laughed about. He hadn't slept since the night of the scarecrow. That image haunted him not because it was violent, not because anything had truly happened, but because something almost did, something he didn't understand. He still felt the presence of it, like a static field. Under his skin, when they'd returned home, the others laughed it off, called it just an old vet with too many movies in his head. But he'd seen the lights in the barn. He'd heard the sound metal on wood, precise and deliberate. He hadn't spoken about it since. Now, his palms were sweating as he stepped through the weeds that edged the man's property. The gate was still broken from the bulldozer incident. He didn't go through it. He walked around, slowly, trying to stay clear of the house itself. The barn sat farther back, slanted with age, but strangely intact. Its floodlight, the one mounted above the doors, wasn't on yet. That made him feel safer, or so he thought. He didn't intend to go inside. He only wanted to leave the note, maybe wedged between the boards of the fence. Something the old man would find and maybe read, not to beg forgiveness, just to admit wrong. But curiosity is a stubborn thing. When he reached the barn, he paused. One door was slightly ajar, not wide, but enough that the crack revealed a slice of darkness deeper. Then night. No tools hung on the outside, no sign of life. He stepped forward. Inside, the air was still so still it felt heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Dust floated in beams of light coming through a broken side window. The boy's shoes creaked on the old wood, but the rest of the barn was silent. Silent except for something faint, like a steady, rhythmic clicking. He turned his head toward the far wall and froze. A table stood there, longer than any standard workbench, covered in precisely arranged objects. Not tools, not weapons, but things. Military manuals, stacks of dog tags bundled together with wire, black and white photographs laid out in grid formation, each labeled with date, rank, location. The faces in the photos stared back, some young, some older, all in uniform. Next to the table, a cabinet stood open, and inside were rows of binders, each labeled with letters and numbers, none of them readable at this distance. The boy's breath caught when he saw what was hanging above the table, a wall-length map, topographic, color-faded, and pinned at the corners. Dozens of red marks dotted the surface, connected with faint black lines, each marked with coordinates. Some matched the ones from the envelope. They didn't know that, but something in him recognized the pattern. He stepped back, and then he heard it. The low growl. Ruckus had emerged silently from the shadows, positioned between the boy and the door. The dog didn't lunge, didn't bark, just stood there, body still, but ready. Eyes locked on the intruder. Behind the dog, deeper in the barn. The old man stepped into the light. He said nothing. The boy couldn't move. The colonel didn't threaten. Didn't reach for anything. He just stood there, eyes locked on the boy with the kind of stare that peeled layers off a person. After a long moment, he nodded once, not as approval, not as permission, but as understanding. The boy turned and fled. He dropped the note somewhere, in the weeds on his way out, never went back for his bike. He ran until his lungs felt torn and his legs burned. And after that night, he never returned, not to the fence line, not to the ridge, not even to that side of the property. He didn't tell anyone what he saw. Some things weren't meant to be explained. The morning came slow, heavy with the kind of silence that made every creak of the house feel like a warning. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but enough light had crept over the hills to cast long, slanted shadows through the trees. The frost on the field still held its shimmer when he opened the front door, coffee cup in hand, ready for the usual routine of scanning the horizon, listening for sounds that didn't belong. But today, something did. The print was there, just one pressed, deep into the dirt at the base of the porch steps. Not a shoe, a boot. Military issue. Size was close to his, but not exact. He stared at it for a long time without moving. The shape was too clean to be old, the edges too sharp. The tread was fresh, unweathered by the wind or last night's brief. He didn't call anyone. Instead, he crouched slowly beside it, setting his coffee down on the top step without looking. He reached toward the print and ran 2 fingers through the edge of the heel. Damp, not mud, but moisture still lingered. The soil hadn't fully dried. This wasn't from yesterday. It was from early morning hours, maybe less. Ruckus stepped out behind him, silent, alert. The dog's nose twitched as he scanned the air, then lowered his head to follow the path. No bark, just a low chuff, almost a question. The colonel rose to his feet and walked the perimeter of the porch. No additional prints, no drag marks. Tire tracks. Whoever had come hadn't approached by vehicle. They'd come on foot, moved carefully, left no trace except the one mark, a deliberate message. Log mistake. He went back inside, locked the door behind him, and stood for a moment in the kitchen with his hand still on the knob. Then he opened the drawer beside the stove and pulled out a small notepad. He added one more entry. 541, footprint, porch, single. He paused, then added a dot in the margin. Just one. He flipped back 3 pages and looked at the pattern. The dots weren't random. They were clustering now. Too many things happening too close together. After breakfast, he stripped the back door locks and replaced the deadbolts. The front got a new cylinder. Not because he believed someone had keys, because whoever left the print hadn't come for a confrontation. They'd come for information, a message without words. And he knew from old experience that silence wasn't safety, It was reconnaissance. The barn got a fresh length of chain. The padlock was moved higher. He resecured the trapdoor beneath the floorboards, the one even local surveyors didn't know existed. The journals were boxed and moved to the crawl space under the stairs. Ruckus followed him everywhere, never more than a few feet away, but said nothing, did nothing. The dog understood by noon. The print was gone. The sun had dried the ground enough that it cracked slightly, and the wind took the top layer of dirt with it. Someone passing by wouldn't have noticed anything out of place, just an old farmhouse. On an aging plot, a man walking his land, a dog at his side. Nothing more, but inside, every movement had shifted. He made no calls, not to the deputy, not to the town, not even to the old number in Virginia he kept taped behind the radio. Then came stillness. Only after that action. That night, as he made his usual rounds with flashlight in hand, he stopped by the porch and stood for a while. He stared at the dirt where the print had been, then turned and looked toward the woods. He said nothing, but inside the house, the radio was already warming up. It happened on a Monday, just after lunch, when the sky was clear and the hum of machines filled the air along the East Ridge. The development site had been growing louder every week. Gravel trucks, soil testers, temporary fencing being driven into ground that had once been pasture. But today, the biggest sound stopped without warning. The excavator, a brand new, bright yellow Komatsu that had only been delivered the week before, locked up mid-turn, then let out a sharp electrical pop. The boom froze in midair. The crew stood around it, confused, then frustrated, then quiet. It wasn't just the arm, the entire console was dead. The foreman climbed up into the cab, tried the ignition, got nothing. No dashboard light, no backup alarm, no hydraulic response. One of the mechanics checked the fuse box and blinked twice. All of it had been wiped like someone had triggered a full system reset from the inside. That wasn't the strangest part. The excavator hadn't been doing anything when it died. It was parked idle bucket resting on the dirt, no pressure on the arm, no weight load. It had been positioned earlier that morning along the southern edge of the plot, close to where the original barbed wire fence had once divided the land. It was no more than 6 feet from the colonel's property line, just enough to be legal, but close enough to feel deliberate. The crew didn't know about the footprint, or the envelope, or the coordinates. They knew about the old man who never smiled and the barn light that never went off. But they didn't think much of him. Until now, no one said it out loud. But the moment stretched into something uneasy. The developer's assistant, a man in his early 30s who liked to call himself Site Logistics, stepped back and made a call from the edge of the lot. He kept his voice low. The mechanic stood by the tracks of the machine, shaking his head, saying words like internal isolation, failure, and not supposed to happen. Another worker checked the drone footage, but the video had cut out. The same moment, the excavator died. Blank screen, then static, then nothing. By late afternoon, a flatbed truck had been called to remove the equipment. It took 2 hours just to get it off the property. Even powered down, the excavator resisted movement, as if the hydraulics refused to release, even when manually overridden. The crew muttered about ghosts, about magnets, about firmware, sabotage, but no one offered to stay late. The colonel, from his porch, said nothing. He watched the commotion through binoculars. Not to be nosy, but to be precise, he logged the time the engine failed, the position of the arm, the exact moment the workers stepped back, hands off, and turned from frustration to confusion. He flipped to a new page in the journal and wrote only one thing. Line cross machine halted. Ruckus sat at the edge of the porch, ears up, tail still, gaze fixed on the men moving. Around the broken machine, the dog didn't bark. He didn't need to. Back at the site, the assistant finally asked the question no one else wanted to say aloud. Should we move the boundary line farther back? The developer wasn't there to answer. He was out of state, in meetings speaking, with investors who had never once stepped foot on the property. But his silence after the text was answer enough. The next morning, a red flag marker was planted 8 feet farther north. No one explained the shift. No permits were refiled, but the new boundary was honored, and the colonel added a second entry. To the journal, they now believe in proximity. That night, the barn light stayed on longer than usual. It started with a simple email to the County Planning Commission. The request came from an unassuming government address, no fanfare, no special clearance code in the subject line. But the signature at the bottom was different. It wasn't from agriculture or zoning, it was from a liaison office linked to the Department of Defense. The message was short, a formal request for archived satellite imagery of parcels 214B through to 18EFN area that included a wide sweep of rural land. Just outside of town, on paper, it looked routine. But buried in the coordinates was one plot that had never drawn much attention. The old farmhouse at the edge of the ridge. No reason was offered, just a polite urgency and an attached authorization, code that no one on the commission had seen before. The county technician flagged it as high priority and forwarded it to his supervisor, who double-checked the origin. It was real, and whatever it was about, it wasn't local. The images were pulled that afternoon. Most were standard resolution scans, archived monthly for land use records, but a handful taken in the past 6 months had been sourced from higher altitude assets. These were sharper, more detailed than anything used for standard planning. The technician noticed oddities in several of the images. The colonel's property was partially obscured either by cloud cover or data masking. One scan showed a large section of the barn, with a heat signature overlay that hadn't been documented before. Another image had a timestamp from 3:12 a.m., showing a faint triangular outline near the western tree line. Not visible to the naked eye, not typical farm equipment. The request was fulfilled, but the technician made a personal copy, not because of curiosity, but because of what happened 2 days later. A man in a dark sedan arrived at the planning office. Just before closing, he wore a visitor's badge that had been printed before he even walked through the door. He asked for the director by name, introduced himself by title only, regional oversight, for something that didn't quite match any agency they recognized. He asked if the satellite images had been shared with any third parties. The answer was no. Then he asked if anyone had accessed them beyond initial processing. The room went quiet. The technician cleared his throat and admitted he had viewed them for quality control. The man nodded, not reprimanding, just acknowledging. Then he asked one last question. Has anyone on that property ever filed a federal clearance waiver in the last 30 years? The answer was no, at least not according to local records. The man left without taking anything. He said thank you. But as he turned, he paused and looked back at the technician. If anything unusual happens around that parcel, he said quietly, don't log it. Just call this number. He handed over a card. No name, just 10 digits. Meanwhile, at the edge of the ridge, the colonel was already adjusting the frequency on his receiver. He'd felt it the night before, when the barn shadows changed shape. Around 3 a.m., not wind, not animals, something above, something familiar. He hadn't heard the aircraft, but he'd seen the stars blink just for a moment right above the west field, a faint hum, the kind that didn't come from any farming drone. Inside the house, the envelope from earlier remained on the table. The GPS coordinates had been transferred to the map on the wall. Red string now traced from Kandahar to Kentucky. Ruckus lay beneath the window, ears twitching, head following the sound of nothing. Something had shifted. The land had always watched the man. Now someone else was watching the land. The black SUV came without escort, without announcement. No markings, no sirens. Just the hum of polished tires on gravel and a dust trail that curled behind it like a whisper. It passed through town in the early morning before most of the shops had opened. No one got a good look at the driver, but everyone noticed the woman who stepped out once it reached the ridge. She wore black slacks, a tailored coat, and a strand of pearls that caught the light with every movement of her neck. Her heels crunched softly against the gravel path as she approached the old farmhouse. No clipboard, no ID badge, just a small leather satchel tucked beneath her arm. Her hair was pinned in place, not a strand loose in the wind, and her face carried the kind of calm that came from long exposure to things that couldn't be spoken of in daylight. The colonel was already on the porch, not seated, not surprised, just standing beside the railing with one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, as if he'd been expecting her. Not necessarily that day. But eventually, she stopped 4 steps from the porch, lifted her chin slightly and said, "You still take your tea black?" He nodded once and turned back into the house. No questions, no greeting. She followed. Inside the house was the same as it had always been, bare floors. no photographs, and furniture that looked more functional than personal. The dog didn't bark. Ruckus stood in the hallway, watching her without blinking, his tail motionless. The woman paused just long enough to acknowledge the animal with a soft glance, then continued into the kitchen. He poured the water. She didn't speak. Once the mugs were filled, she set her satchel down on the table and took the seat across from him. She didn't open the bag. She didn't remove any files. The conversation didn't begin with business. Instead, she said, "They think you're still listed as retired." He didn't smile. "I am." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "That's never really been true." The tea sat untouched between them. He waited. She leaned forward slightly. "You received the coordinates?" He nodded again. "I marked them. And the image? It was taken in 86 base perimeter, Southern Gate, 2 days before everything changed." She let the silence rest between them. Not heavy, just long enough to say everything else didn't need to be spoken aloud. Finally, she reached into the satchel and pulled out a folded piece of linen cloth. Inside it, a single metal object, no larger than a coin. Old, tarnished. The emblem stamped into it wasn't modern. It belonged to something older, pre-digital, pre-dash records. She slid it across the table. He didn't touch it, just looked there. "Waking up again?" she said quietly. "Not just here." 3 sites in the last 6 months, all connected to the same grid. He stared at the coin. "This wasn't supposed to resurface." "It wasn't," she said. "But the moment the drone failed, someone flagged it. The moment the satellite feed stuttered, someone else noticed." He finally reached for the metal, turning it over. Once, in his fingers, it still had the weight of memory. "They're not going to ask," she added. "Not yet. They're going to wait. They want to see if the field resolves itself." He looked up, and if it doesn't, she met his eyes. "Then they'll come with more than helicopters." They sat in silence after that. Eventually, the tea went cold. She stood without touching the cup, retrieved the cloth, and placed it back into her satchel. Before leaving, she turned back to him. "We'll say this was just a visit. Old friends, nothing more." He didn't respond. The SUV left as quietly as it arrived. No one saw which direction it turned once it passed the tree line. But later that night, from the edge of town, a few watchers claimed they saw headlights pause at the overlook near the old communications tower, and from the porch. Under a sky that refused to stay still, the colonel stood with the coin still in his hand, listening for a hum that wasn't wind. The barn hadn't been fully lit in years. Most locals assumed it was used for storage tools, fencing, maybe a few rusting machines no longer in service. But that night, as dusk settled over the ridge and the sky bled into a faint purple wash, light spilled from the narrow windows of the old structure. Not the flicker of a lantern or the faint buzz of a work lamp, but clean. Steady illumination, bright, purposeful. The woman from DC returned just after sunset. This time, she didn't knock at the house. The black SUV pulled directly behind the barn and idled for a moment. Then she stepped out alone, walked with measured confidence toward the large wooden doors, and disappeared inside. She was in there for exactly 61 minutes. The driver stayed in the vehicle, hands gripped. On the wheel, eyes locked on the structure in front of him. He kept the engine running. A faint tremor in his jaw betrayed the stillness of his posture. He hadn't been briefed on what the meeting was about. He hadn't been cleared for that level. But he knew the routine drive, the personnel, say nothing, see less. But something about this stop was different. Inside the barn, it was quiet. Thick insulation beneath the old boards masked the outside world. The glow came from a portable rig set into the rafters, one he hadn't used in decades, but had maintained like clockwork. The air smelled faintly of oil, wood dust, and something else older, like sealed paper and solder. In the center of the barn sat a table, not large, but heavy. A military crate had been set upon it, opened its contents, laid out with surgical precision schematics, a rolled satellite image marked with concentric rings, a field journal whose leather cover bore a faded unit insignia that hadn't existed publicly in over 30 years. She stood beside the table, studying each item silently. He didn't explain. He didn't offer context. She knew what she was looking at one point, she reached into her coat and removed a small plastic sleeve. Inside it, a data chip. She placed it beside the journal and for the first time since entering, she spoke. This was intercepted last week. He picked it up, turned it over once in his fingers, then slid it into a concealed reader beneath the table. The monitor built into a false wall panel and hidden behind an old grain sack flickered to life. No signal ID, just infrared footage. A structure half sunken in a dense forest. A figure walking along its roof. A date stamp in the corner. 6 days ago, not ours, she said. He nodded slowly. They're not field testing anymore. They're installing. She didn't argue. She simply stepped back and allowed him to close the crate again. Neither of them mentioned the excavator or the drone or the footprint. They didn't need to. Every sign pointed in the same direction. Lines were being crossed, not politically, but structurally, quiet moves on old maps. When she finally stepped outside, the driver quickly opened the door for her, but she paused, glanced back toward the barn, and tilted her head slightly, as if listening. Then she said softly, "He's awake." Then he didn't answer. She didn't expect him to. The barn door closed behind her with a gentle thud. No creak, no lock turning, just quiet finality. As she climbed into the back seat, the driver's hands trembled slightly, his knuckles pale against the wheel. "You okay?" she asked without looking at him. He hesitated, then said, "What was all that?" She glanced at the rearview mirror, met his eyes once. "A reminder," she said, "that some men don't retire, they just wait." The SUV pulled away down the ridge, taillights disappearing into the dark curve of the road. And in the barn, the light flicked off one section at a time until only the map remained, faintly glowing from the heat left behind. The message came through just after 3 a.m. not during an emergency. Not in response to any report, but left quietly on the voicemail system of the county dispatcher. It was short, just one line, spoken in a tired, gravel-tinged voice that didn't belong to a man guessing whatever's happening. I'd let it play out. Don't get in his way. There was no context, no name mentioned, but no one needed clarification. The call had come from Sheriff Ellis, a man who rarely left messages and even more rarely offered warnings. Before taking over as Sheriff, Ellis had served as a deputy for nearly 2 decades. Before that, he was Army, different theater, different war. But he knew the colonel, not socially, not through Sunday meetings or neighborly exchange. They shared something quieter service, memory, and the agreement to stay out of each other's shadows. The dispatcher replayed the message twice before forwarding it. To the county administrator, it spread quietly through the small network of local officials. The code was clear enough. Stand down, don't provoke, don't intervene, just wait. By sunrise, the sheriff had already driven out to the edge of town, not to the farm itself, but near enough to keep watch. He parked off the main road beneath a grove of pine, rolled down his window, and watched as the wind moved through the fields. Ruckus could be seen from a distance sitting like a sentinel near the fence line, eyes fixed toward the tree line. Ellis didn't get out of the vehicle. He had once seen the colonel disarm a man in under 2 seconds, not during combat, but in a convenience store back in 1993 when a stranger had tried to rob the clerk. The colonel hadn't even raised his voice, just stepped forward, redirected the man's arm, and placed him on the floor so gently it looked like choreography. Then he left without giving a name. That memory had never left him. Now, with the barn still quiet and the air thick with something that didn't come from weather, Ellis leaned back in his seat and reviewed what he knew. The drone failure, the construction mishap, the sudden visit from the woman in pearls, unmarked helicopters doing slow passes over old cornfields, and that call he wasn't supposed to receive last week from a federal liaison asking if the colonel had remained. Consistent in his patterns. Consistent. That was their word for it. What they meant was, is he stable? Ellis had laughed at that, as if anyone in this town was more consistent than the colonel. He rose at the same time every day, walked the same path, kept records with precision, spoke only when necessary, the kind of man who didn't panic not even when he probably should. Back at the station, the deputies were uneasy. They'd heard the rumors about things buried under the barn, about classified missions that were later scrubbed from official records, about maps that couldn't be found anymore. None of it had ever been confirmed, but Ellis had seen enough. Long before the new developers started flattening boundaries and playing with noise, He didn't tell anyone what he'd really heard. Last month, that a retired officer with no current clearance had pinged 3 independent federal systems without touching a keyboard, that the encryption protocol used was so old, most analysts didn't recognize it, and the ones who did went quiet. It wasn't hacking, it was signaling. So the sheriff left the message, not even as advice, but as a quiet boundary, something local law would not cross. The colonel was operating on a clock older than permits, older than zoning lines, older than anyone sitting in the county seat. And Ellis knew better than to get between that man and whatever history had. Just knocked at his door, so he waited. Just out of sight, just out of reach, watching the field, listening to the stillness, and letting it play out. Jake Felder didn't mean to stir trouble. He just wanted answers. Living to parcels down from the old farmhouse, he had always chalked up the colonel's odd routines to military habits. But lately, things had shifted. The lights in the barn stayed on through the night. Strange visitors in black vehicles came and went without headlights, and something he wasn't sure what kept triggering his motion lights between midnight and dawn. So he set up one of his hunting cameras, high-end, infrared, with backup memory storage and weatherproof casing. Jake positioned it at the edge of his property, angled discreetly through a thin screen of cedar and brush, directly facing the far corner of the colonel's pasture. The spot where, just last week, he thought he'd seen a tall figure standing motionless at 2 a.m. too tall to be human, to still to be casual. He checked the camera the next morning. Nothing. Then again, the following night, same result. But on the third morning, the memory card had been corrupted. He replaced the unit, this time connecting a second trail cam as backup, syncing them to his phone so he'd get a live alert. That night, around 3:27 a.m., the alert buzzed. Jake was already awake. He'd half hoped it would happen. He slipped out of bed, grabbed his boots, and went to the shed. From his phone, he opened the feed at first. Just static. Then something moved. A shape crossed the screens. Low, deliberate, no sound. Not quite human in its silhouette. Broad shoulders, narrow frame. Its motion wasn't natural. Each step looked too smooth, like it was floating just an inch above the ground. The camera refocused, trying to recalibrate with the shifting infrared light. But just as the figure reached the fence line, the screen went black. Then came a flash, one single burst of white across the frame, static again, and then nothing. Jake ran out to the tree line before the sun came up. His heart was pounding. Flashlight in hand, shotgun slung over his shoulder, more out of habit than threat. The camera casing was still there, though the metal clasp had warped slightly, like it had been exposed to sudden heat. The inside smelled, faintly, of melted plastic. The second unit was dead, its lens cracked clean down the middle. He brought both cameras back inside, popped out the memory cards, and tried to recover the data on his laptop. Only one card gave anything usable about. 7 seconds of footage before the signal degraded into colored lines and silence. But those 7 seconds showed something. Not just the tall shape, not just movement. There were smaller flickers in the background, multiple sources of heat. Figures, possibly, or devices. Their outlines were vague, but too symmetrical to be animals. Then came the last frame before the footage went dark. It wasn't the colonel. It wasn't any of the developers' hired workers. It wasn't military gear Jake recognized from his own years in the National Guard. It was something else, something wrapped in shadow, but wearing what looked like a harness with faint lights that blinked in pattern, purposeful. Not decorative, Jake stared at the frame until his laptop powered itself down. He hadn't touched a single key. The next morning, he didn't mention it to his wife. He just took the memory card, snapped it in half, and flushed the pieces. He didn't go near the fence again, and he never tried to replace the camera. But when the sheriff came around the next week, making quiet rounds in his unmarked car, Jake didn't wait for questions. He opened the door, handed him the dead camera, and simply said, "Tell him I'm not looking anymore." The sheriff gave a slow nod. That was enough, and from that night forward, Jake kept his curtains drawn, even on warm nights, because some things weren't meant to be captured, and others didn't like being watched. The first hum wasn't audible, it was felt. A vibration beneath the floorboards, subtle enough to confuse with an idling truck on a distant road. But there was no engine nearby. no headlights on the gravel, just a low tremor that stirred the glasses in the cupboard and made the metal rooster on Jake Felder's fence pivot slightly. Without wind, at 2:41 a.m., the signals dropped, not gradually, not in flickers. Every cell phone, every digital clock synced to satellite time. Every Wi-Fi, router, and Bluetooth-connected device within 3 miles of the Colonel's farm, cut to zero-dot screens, went black. Alarms reset. GPS screens froze. The tower, down at Mackenzie Hill, went offline. No known outage was reported. It came without warning. It lasted just under 8 minutes. And in that time, 4 helicopters appeared. They didn't arrive in formation. They didn't follow a known flight path. They weren't part of any published FAA notice or local flight schedule. They simply materialized one by one over the ridge. No INSIGNIAS, no navigation lights, no rotor noise. They hovered silently, too low for comfort, too high for identification. Just outlines against the faint starlight, motionless above the Colonel's land. One held position directly above the barn, another positioned over the western tree line. The third hovered beyond the creek near the old well. The fourth drifted briefly, scanning in overlapping circles before stilling itself along the eastern boundary. Those awake saw them. But no one reached for a phone, and even if there had been, no one quite knew what to say. In the absence of noise, the presence of the machines was somehow louder. A young woman on the edge of the development snapped a photo with her DSLR, the lens cracked. The image file corrupted. Before it finished writing to the card, she never tried again. Inside the barn, the Colonel didn't look up. He was already dressed, sitting at the small wooden table where the crate had once rested. His journal was open, his pen moving with steady rhythm. Ruckus sat beside him, unmoving, ears tilted slightly toward the soundless sky. He didn't reach for a weapon, he didn't alert anyone, he simply recorded. When the tremor began to subside, the air temperature shifted, a drop 10 degrees in under 30 seconds. A few trees along the perimeter showed signs of wind that hadn't touched the rest of the field. A strange resonance lingered, like the afterring of a bell, but without a source. It faded slowly, absorbed by the soil. Then they were gone. No retreating flight pattern, no acceleration. The helicopters didn't turn or climb. They simply vanished, as if someone had switched off a projection. The silence remained, deepened somehow. As if space had been carved open and sealed again too quickly, cell signals returned at 2:49 a.m. All clocks jumped forward except the Colonel's, which had kept ticking in silence, unaffected by dawn. Rumors had already spread. The sheriff said nothing. The woman from D.C. didn't return, but something had changed. The developers, who usually began work at 7 sharp, kept their machines idle. The foreman spent most of the morning on a satellite phone behind the trailer, pacing, pale. Jake noticed new lines marked in the dirt near the fence line, not by his hand, not by surveyors. They were clean, arced, and etched to precisely to be casual. At the feed store, no one mentioned the helicopters directly, but no one laughed that day either. The Colonel sat on his porch with his journal and a cup of tea, just watching, just waiting. The quiet had returned, but everyone knew it wouldn't last. It wasn't the whole field, just one narrow strip, maybe 20 feet wide and 70 feet long, sitting perfectly centered between 2 half-buried cedar posts that no one could remember being installed. To the untrained eye, it looked like any other stretch of earth, soft rows, dark soil, the remnants of dried grass along the edges. But anyone who lived nearby, anyone who passed it more than once, knew something was wrong. It was always raked, not occasionally, not seasonally, not seasonally always, no matter the weather, no matter the time of year. When the rest of the field grew tangled with goldenrod, thistle, and switchgrass, that section remained clean, combed, and flawless. During the rainstorm that knocked out power to half the county, Jake Felder drove by and saw it. The winds had upturned trash bins and scattered shingles, but the raked section, untouched. The soil still held the same shallow grooves, perfectly parallel. No water pooling in the center, no debris resting on top. It didn't make sense. One night, a group of teenagers from the new development dared each other to walk across it. They'd heard stories, of course, about the old veteran, the helicopters, the missing drone butt that only made it more enticing. 3 of them crept out past the fence after midnight, cutting through the creek bed to avoid detection. One brought a phone with the flashlight on, another carried a GoPro on a makeshift headband. They made it about 6 feet in before something changed. The air went still, not quiet still, like the sound had been sucked out of the space entirely. The flashlight flickered once, then died. The GoPro continued to record, but when they reviewed the footage later, it showed only vertical gray lines, like tracking distortion from an old VHS tape. The microphone picked up a low-frequency hum, barely audible, but growing louder the closer they got to the center. They didn't make it to the middle. One of them, the smallest, screamed, not from pain, but something stranger. He couldn't explain it afterward, just kept saying he felt a pressure in his chest, like something behind his ribs was being turned outward. He dropped to his knees and crawled backward until the others grabbed him and pulled him out. They never returned. The very next morning, the field was raked again, not destroyed. The grooves were back in place, pristine, as if nothing had touched them. No footprints, no marks, just silence and symmetry. No one ever saw the colonel tend to it. No equipment, no rake leaning against a fence, no tire marks from a tractor, but it stayed perfect. The soil itself was strange, darker than the rest of the field, as if it had been treated or not touched at all. Local soil scientists had once tried to get samples from surrounding properties for a mapping project. When they came to his land and asked to test that section, the colonel declined. He didn't explain, he just stared until they left. Years ago, before the developers came, before the new roads and estate homes, there had been rumors that the field had once served as a staging site for experimental training exercises, but no records backed that up. The county had no permits, no maps, no military easements on file. Still, the stories lingered. Satellite images from mapping services often blurred that section of the property. Not fully, but enough that pixels looked distorted when zoomed in. At first, it was dismissed as compression errors. Then, a local journalist submitted a FOIA request for historical aerial photos. The request was denied. National Interest, Section 3, exemption. He didn't try again. Those who had grown up nearby simply stopped asking. And yet, every week, no matter the season, the field was always the same. Raked, untouched, waiting. Even the crows avoided it. He came without calling first, just rolled his rusted pickup into the gravel and stepped out slowly, as if unsure whether to walk to the door or turn back around. Franklin Meeks hadn't seen the colonel in over 20 years, not since they'd both worked on a classified infrastructure contract outside of Fort Bragg. Back then, he was a systems engineer with clearance he never asked for, and the colonel wasn't yet a colonel. Just a man with hard eyes and quiet shoes who asked smart questions and wrote nothing down. Now he was older, slower, carrying a rolled-up cylinder wrapped in brown paper under one arm and a folder that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The colonel opened the door before Franklin knocked. No words, just a nod, and the 2 men walked into the barn. They didn't speak for the first 5 minutes. The dog, Ruckus, circled once and laid. Down near the wall, a low hum from the bulb overhead flickered once and steadied. Franklin placed the brown cylinder on the table, unwrapped it carefully, revealing an old blueprint stiff, faded at the corners. The paper yellowed with time. He flattened it with 2 metal washers he pulled from his coat pocket and opened the folder. Inside were photographs, pencil notes, and a punch card with 4 missing tabs. The colonel didn't ask where it came from. He already knew Franklin tapped a section in the middle of the blueprint, a faint square marked substructure ecosystem. We're told it was a backup relay for early warning systems, redundant off-grid, never built out. But that's not true, is it? The colonel said nothing. Franklin opened the folder and pulled out a photo. Grainy aerial. Center, a field. The same shape, the same curve of trees. No farmhouse yet, no barn. Just a clean marked square and a faint trail of tire tracks leading to it. I was tasked with building the enclosure shell. Never knew what went inside, but you were there when they sealed it. Still, the colonel didn't speak, but he did sit. He placed his journal beside the blueprint and opened it halfway. A page with only coordinates, handwritten, and 1 word below it. Stand by. Franklin exhaled slowly. He hadn't expected answers, only acknowledgement. He ran his hand across the blueprint again, eyes tracing the annotations. There was no power line feeding that section, no data cables. It wasn't on any regional grid. 2 of them hidden under soil berms, not marked and red marked in white ink. Invisible unless you tilted the paper just so. "What's under there?" Franklin asked, his voice almost inaudible. The colonel finally looked up. "Insurance." The word hung in the air like fog. Franklin didn't press. He just nodded, packed the photo back into the folder, and turned the blueprint slightly so the colonel could see the lower corner a stamped code, half faded but still legible. It matched the slip of numbers from the envelope the colonel had. Received weeks earlier, it was never decommissioned, Franklin said, more to himself than anyone else. "All these years, I thought it was mothballed. But this," the colonel leaned forward and tapped a small marking near the center of the print, something that looked like a hatch. Beneath it, barely visible in the fading ink, were the letters. C-7-L. Franklin whispered, "That's not a relay." "No," the colonel said, "it's a lock." They both sat back. The air in the barn thickened, not with heat, but with memory years of secrets, half-told truths, and something older beneath it all. Something waiting. Franklin rolled the blueprint back into the cylinder and set it down beside the colonel. "I kept it in a silo behind my tools. Figured someday someone would ask about it." "No one will," the colonel replied. Franklin stood, nodded once more, and left without another word. Outside, the wind had picked up, but the field remained raked. The convoy arrived just after noon. 3 black SUVs, 1 silver van with tinted windows, and a camera crew in a rented box truck emblazoned with a local news affiliate's logo. The lead vehicle had the developer's logo printed in gold on the side, sleek and shining against the dirt road that led to the colonel's property. At the front, Trevor Langford, the young man behind the entire estate project, stepped out with polished boots that sank awkwardly into the gravel. He was flanked by 2 attorneys and a production assistant who looked barely out of college, holding a clipboard and a lapel mic with shaking hands. A drone launched with a low buzz from the roof of the truck, rising slowly and circling over the barn as if scanning for movement. Another hovered above the raked field, holding a steady, eerie position. They didn't approach the porch. They didn't knock. Instead, Trevor stepped onto the colonel's private land with a smirk and a megaphone. "To the resident of this property," he began, his voice sharp and artificial over the distorted speaker, "you have been notified. On 3 separate occasions of your known compliance with county modernization standards, we have given every opportunity for dialogue and compromise. The barn door didn't open, the dog didn't bark. Nothing stirred." Trevor glanced at his assistant and waved for the cameras to start rolling. A second drone shifted its position and moved in closer, its red light blinking as it locked on to a facial recognition target, though no face had yet appeared. "You are now officially being served notice," Trevor continued, louder this time. "Our attorneys are filing for easement seizure and encroachment violation. You have 30 days to vacate, or we will proceed with court action. Your refusal to engage in good faith negotiations will be documented right here, right now, the public to see." His attorney stepped forward and placed a sealed envelope into a clear plastic box. The assistant carried it down the gravel path and set it gently on the colonel's front porch. Still no movement from inside. Trevor's smile thinned. The cameras kept rolling behind him. One of the attorneys leaned in and whispered something about optics, about local sympathy, veterans, how this could backfire. Trevor ignored him. This was about control. No one in this town had said no to him before. Not the planning board, not the bank, not even the mayor, who quietly approved the zoning changes without a vote. The colonel was the last holdout, and, to Trevor, the silence felt like defiance. A gust of wind blew across the field, lifting small whirlwinds of dust around the raked strip. The drone above it suddenly dipped, glitched, and dropped 3 feet before correcting itself. The camera on it blinked off, then rebooted in mid-air. No one noticed. Trevor took a final step forward and raised the megaphone again. "Consider this your last chance," he said, his voice louder now, echoing off the tin roof of the barn. "You may think your past matters. It doesn't. Progress is coming, and you're in the way." He waited. A long moment passed. Then, without warning, the barn door creaked. It didn't swing open, just shifted slightly. enough to catch the light and show the sliver of shadow within. Ruckus stepped out, not barking, just standing, his eyes locked on Trevor.com, motionless, like a statue in Fur Dot. Trevor lowered the megaphone. He didn't. Move forward again. The assistant whispered something about the dog. The attorney began to collect the files. The drones circled once more, then returned to their stations. Trevor turned back to war at the SUV. "Let him have his 30 days, he muttered. "We'll win in court." But his voice didn't sound as certain as before. As they packed up and drove away, the colonel watched from inside. Not angry, not shaken. He marked another page in the journal and waited. It started with the birds. Not their songs, those had already faded, but their absence. The barn usually echoed faintly with the chirp of sparrows nesting in its eaves, but by late afternoon that day, not a single sound remained. Just an eerie quiet, as if the air itself had forgotten how to carry noise. Ruckus noticed first. The dog stood motionless at the edge of the porch, ears tilted not forward, but back, scanning something not yet visible. His tail didn't wag. His breath slowed. He took one step down the wooden stairs, then stopped and stared toward the field. Inside the house, the colonel had paused mid-sentence in his journal. The silence wasn't normal. Not in the way city folks think of quiet. This was the kind that stretched too long, like something holding its breath. He set the pen down and reached slowly for the chain above the table lamp, turning off the light. Outside, not even insects, hummed. The cows in the neighbor's pasture had been restless all morning, lowing and pacing the fence line. But now, there were still two. Huddled near the far end of the field, they faced one direction as if they'd agreed on something they couldn't explain. Their ears flicked nervously, then stilled. One kicked the dirt once, but didn't move. Again, the sky was bright, too bright, not warm or yellow, just pale, bleached, almost dot at 3:42 p.m. The first wave of dust lifted not from the gravel path, but from the raked strip of field that hadn't changed in months. It didn't gust. Like wind-blown soil, it spiraled slowly in tight vertical coils, as if being drawn upward by something unseen. Ruckus growled low, but didn't bark. The colonel stepped outside without hurry. No weapons, no binoculars, just him, a hat pulled low, and his service. Dog at his heel, he walked to the edge of the porch and looked toward the field. There were no tire tracks, no footprints, no drones in the sky. But the dust kept rising, not blowing, lifting. The raked lines of the field remained perfectly intact, even as the particles separated from the ground. It was as though the grooves themselves were untouched, only the space. Between them, disturbed somewhere beyond the tree line, a deer broke cover and sprinted hard across the gully. It didn't stop. It didn't look back. The movement startled no other wildlife because there was nothing left to startle. The silence had spread to every inch of land in a 5-mile radius. In the estate development across the property line, the contractors had gone home early. One had mentioned a strange pressure in his ears, like the change before a tornado. Another said his watch stopped ticking at exactly 2 p.m. He didn't return after lunch. At the local diner. Only 2 booths remained filled. Most of the usual crowd had left without ordering. They couldn't put it into words. Just a wait, some said, a feeling in their bones. The colonel watched the spiral rise higher, forming a narrow funnel, barely wider than a doorway, reaching 30 feet into the air. It didn't drift, it didn't widen. It just hovered, unmoving and perfect. Like the field had exhaled something it had held for years. Then it stopped, not faded, not dispersed, stopped. The funnel vanished in an instant, as if erased from the air itself, and still the field remained untouched. No footprints, no marks, not a single grain of soil out of place. Ruckus sat beside the colonel, panting quietly now, but calm. He didn't need a command. The colonel turned and walked back inside. There was no alarm, no sirens, no wind. But across the country, at a data center tied to a 3-letter agency, an automated alert lit up a dormant console. The status changed from standby to stirred. It began just after midnight. The colonel had been asleep in the chair near the back window, a habit formed long ago in barracks and tents where the back wall was safest. Ruckus stirred first, his ears twitching as a low hum pressed against the edges of silence, not mechanical, not wind, a resonance that moved beneath the floorboards. as if something deep underground had remembered it existed. By the time the colonel opened his eyes, the raked field was glowing, not brightly, soft, pulsing luminescence that outlined the grooves in the dirt. Each ridge shimmered faintly, as if coated in some transparent film, reacting to light that wasn't visible to the naked eye. The hum and quaked. No vibration, no quake, just sound, coming not from the sky, but from beneath. He stood, slipped on his boots, and walked out into the night without turning on a single light. The barn's flood lamp remained off. The stars above were clear. No clouds, no moon, just that strange glow ahead. He stepped onto the edge of the raked section with calm precision. Ruckus followed at his side. At precisely 12:14 a.m., the soil shifted. No collapse, no blast, just a deliberate division. As if the ground had been waiting for the signal to part, from the center of the field, a rectangle slowly rose. 4 feet by 8, metal on all sides, edges rounded and precise. Its surface was matte black, with strips of dust still clinging to seams that hadn't seen open air in over 4 decades. No hydraulics, no noise, just rising. The soil slid off, the top and down the sides, in a perfect cascade, leaving behind a shape that looked more like a vault than a door, and then it stopped. The hum ceased. Silence again. On the front of the structure, a small panel blinked to life. Green, then blue, then green again. A keypad, old yet functional. Its casing was made of a thick composite something, not quite metal, not quite plastic. Near the top, barely visible, were the faded markings, C7L, the same as in the blueprint. The colonel didn't move. He stood for several long minutes, watching the blinking light, listening to nothing. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out the envelope from the mailbox, the one with the photograph and GPS coordinates. Behind the photo, hidden until now, was a second slip of paper, a 6-digit code. He walked forward slowly and knelt beside the panel. Ruckus sat behind him, unblinking. The buttons responded with a soft click under his fingers. 5.2.4.2 4.1 7 3. The blinking stopped. There was no dramatic hiss of air release, no spinning lock or grinding of gears. Instead, the rectangle began to lower, again only this time. The surface split in two, revealing a descending staircase lined with embedded lights that flickered as they powered on. Soft amber tones lit the passage, descending at a sharp angle. The air that emerged smelled not of earth, but of filtered sterility, like the inside of an old bunker still running on reserve systems. As the colonel stared down into the depths, something shifted inside him. Not panic, not fear. Recognition. He turned back toward the house and let out a short, quiet whistle. Ruckus stood and followed. They descended together. Behind them, the door remained open at the edge of the field, just outside the ring of light. The grass swayed once, though there was no wind, and far above, at a flight altitude well above civilian radar, something else was already watching. Not to stop it, just to confirm it had begun. The transmission didn't come through any civilian network, not radio, not internet, not even satellite. It began on a dormant military frequency, last used in 1991 scrum mode, encoded, buried so deep that only a handful of listening stations still monitored it out of habit. A ghost channel kept on out of protocol rather than expectation. Somewhere in a cold monitoring post in Alaska, a technician leaned forward in confusion as the static that usually filled channel 4407 suddenly cut. No static. Just silence. Then, one voice, male, mid-40s, no accent, .com. Not rushed, just deliberate. Site 17 is intact. Guardian still active, then silence again. Across 3 continents, classified alert flags lit up on screens, never meant to be used again. In underground installations, analysts were roused from sleep and handed printed transcripts with no explanation. In a mobile operations van in the Arizona desert, an old colonel who hadn't heard that phrase in 30 years quietly removed his glasses and said nothing for a full minute. The code was never meant to be public. It didn't appear in any searchable database. It didn't even exist on paper after 1983. Guardian still active was a condition green alertment, only to signal one thing: containment had not failed. because the asset had not been breached. It also meant that the protocol had been voluntarily reactivated from inside the site. No breach, no trigger. The Guardian had returned willingly. In Washington, a woman in pearls answered her secure phone without saying a word. The voice on the other end simply said, "It's him." She nodded once, hung up, and placed the envelope from the Colonel on a different shelf, one lined with tags marked redundant, reserved, and myth. Outside the farmhouse. The raked field had gone still again. No glow, no humming, just untouched soil. Beneath an unremarkable night sky. Inside the open hatch, the amber lights continued to glow softly, illuminating a stairwell that disappeared deep into the earth. But at the bottom, things had changed. The Colonel stood at a rusted console now. Humming faintly with life, he'd flipped a single switch. No more, no less. A green light blinked on a monitor marked Kumox, a one that had remained dark since the Reagan administration. He hadn't spoken into the mic. He didn't need to. The act of re-entry itself sent the signal. The system was built that way. And the phrase was embedded in the protocol automated non-negotiable, keyed to the presence of his ID tag and biometric confirmation. No one else could have triggered it. He stepped back and looked around the room. Dust covered most of the surfaces, but under the layer of time, everything was as it had been. A cot, a locker, a steel cabinet lined with binders, their labels still legible. A grip roach, Counter-X, Phoenix Cycle. He didn't open them. Not yet. The service dog lay down quietly at his side, ears twitching at the low mechanical hum now gently vibrating through the floor. Outside, miles away, a satellite pivoted mid-orbit, its trajectory reprogrammed to hold stationary above the small dot on the map labeled Private Holding Inactive. The label disappeared 2 minutes later. No alarm, no scramble order, just a slow reclassification of a location from dormant to monitored. At the local sheriff's station, Deputy Marshal Edwards once, his unit partner, picked up the old secure phone beneath the desk. No one ever used it. It hadn't rung in decades. But he dialed a number anyway, one he never forgot. It rang once. Then a voice answered, "Stand by, confirmed." Edwards didn't say a word. He just hung up, locked the front door, and placed the close sign in the window, back beneath the field. The Colonel sat in the metal chair, one hand resting on the dog's back. The broadcast had gone out, and somewhere, the people who remembered Site 17 were already making preparations. The porch creaked softly beneath the weight of his boots as he settled into the chair. Same one he'd sat in for the past 23 years. The mug in his hands was chipped, but warm. He didn't glance up as the first shadow passed over the yard. He didn't need to. The soundless churn of rotor blades far above told him more than any news article ever could. They were back. This time, not hidden. They didn't hover just out of sight or vanish behind clouds. They circled slow, deliberate, high enough not to stir the treetops, but low enough to be seen. 4 of them, identical. No markings, just steady motion and silent eyes in the sky. He sipped his coffee across the property line. The estate stood hollow, shutters drawn, grass overgrown. A for sale sign leaned sideways in the gravel drive, its post cracked at the base like someone had tried to wrench it free in a hurry. The couple who once spoke in legal threats and digital contracts had left quietly. No party, no press release, no trucks, just gone. The contractors never returned after the second incident. The equipment was pulled overnight. The boundary tape remained. Bright red plastic looped through metal stakes, trembling slightly in the wind. The town didn't ask questions anymore. They used to call him the old man with the shovel, whispering behind shelves at the feed store, trading stories like cards, war stories, ghost stories, crazy stories. But now, when his name came up, conversations grew short. Faces stiffened. The subject shifted fast. The deputy, now sheriff, never stopped by unannounced. But every 2 weeks, a small envelope showed up on the porch step. No return address, just a date written in small black ink. Inside, a note, all clear, no contact. Standing protocol maintained. That was all he needed. The field was sealed now, not with gates or fences, but with silent authorization. The kind of permission granted from places people didn't know existed. He didn't need guards. He didn't want them. They wouldn't understand the machines below the soil. Wouldn't understand the purpose of silence. Ruckus lay at his feet, calm eyes half closed, but his ears tracked the movement overhead. The helicopters hadn't changed formation in an hour. The colonel tapped, one finger against the handle of the mug. He hadn't spoken a word since the broadcast. Didn't need to. The message was received. All those years people laughed, calling him paranoid, broken, a recluse playing soldier in his overalls. They meant nothing now, because nobody was laughing anymore. Not the teens who vandalized his signs, not the developers who threatened his boundaries, not the officials who once filed anonymous complaints about noise or permits. The town left him alone. The silence wasn't isolation now. It was respect, earned in years, built in secrets, paid for in names and codes and coordinates, that had never made it into any digital archive. The dog stirred slightly, ears flicking once as a fifth shadow appeared, this one different, smaller, quieter. It hovered only briefly, then ascended sharply and disappeared beyond the tree line. The colonel didn't follow it. With his eyes, he just finished his coffee, set the mug down on the old table beside the folded journal, and leaned back in the chair. The wood groaned softly beneath him. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the edge of the field where nothing ever grew. Waiting, just watching, he'd already done what needed to be done. The rest was memory and motion, and the occasional low hum under the earth that only he and Ruckus ever seemed to notice. They didn't laugh anymore, because now everyone understood that man wasn't crazy, he was prepared.